from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
Election day arrives as the government shutdown matches the all-time record. Welcome to the Tuesday edition, live from New York, as voters cast ballots in a series of races that we're watching across the country. And coming up, we'll get the latest on the shutdown from Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall in Washington, with updates on the elections from Romaine Bostick in New Jersey and Greg Giroux in Virginia. Later this hour, we'll compare notes with Republican strategist Lanhee Chen, all part of our coverage on this election day on Bloomberg TV and radio. And we start with a look at Wall Street. Charlie Pellet has that for us from World Headquarters here in New York. Charlie?
Thank you very much, Joe Mathieu. We got the bears voting decisively right now, with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the red. The S&P looking at a 71-point drop right now at 6780, down now by 1%. The Dow down 282, down 0.6. NASDAQ down 385, drop there of 1.6%. Stocks are tumbling. Risk-off sentiment returns to markets following results out of Palantir Technologies. Also, warnings from Wall Street executives chief executives that the equity market is due for a pullback. Again, the S&P now down by 1.1%. Your 10-year at 4.08%, with a 2-year currently yielding 3.57%. Spot gold is down $45 the ounce, $39.55. That is a drop of 1.1%. Silver down 1%, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.5%, $60.77 a barrel. Bitcoin now down 5.5%. Bitcoin at 100,941. Bears repeating. Bitcoin right now selling off big time, down 5.5%. Palantir Technologies after earnings down now by 7%. And Nvidia retreating today. Nvidia down by 3%. We got you covered on markets. Recapping: S&P down by 1%, 6780. And one more quote on that: Bitcoin down by 5.5%. Balance of power continues right now. Election Day 2025. He's here in New York. Once again, your host, Joe Mathieu.
Charlie, thank you so much. We'll have more from Charlie Pellet on the Tuesday trade, the Election Day trade, in just about 20 minutes time from now. A risk-off session. We'll see if it stays that way as we work through this day that has voters waiting in lines in New York, in Virginia, in New Jersey. Not always in lines after seeing a massive surge in early voting. And we're going to spend some time over the next hour picking through each of these races with some of the smartest people in the business, including right here at Bloomberg. We'll connect with Tyler Kendall in a moment in Washington, with Romaine Bostick in New Jersey, as we set the stage for what could be a very late evening here. Greg Giroux will have more coming up from Virginia as well, with a very important gubernatorial contest that's been unfolding there. Let's start in New York, though, where the self-described Democratic Socialist Zohran Mamdani is apparently cruising to a victory. We've talked about the polls here for weeks. Double-digit lead on the poly market. He's got a 95% chance of victory. And Republicans have been urging GOP voters to back Andrew Cuomo in an effort to keep Mamdani out of office. Elon Musk, Stephen Miller, and yes, even Donald Trump endorsing Cuomo in the 11th hour of this race. Of course, this follows weeks, months, really, of rhetoric from the president of the United States aimed at Mamdani, who he calls a communist. Let's remember.
You have a communist running, and you shouldn't vote for him. He's a disaster.
You know, he's running against a communist. I would think that he would have a good shot of winning. He's a communist. I don't think our country is ready for a communist.
I'd prefer not to have a communist mayor of New York City. And, you know, that's what he is based on his policy. Democrats have become radical left lunatics. They have policies that nobody's going to buy. And, you know, I see what's going on in New York. We're going to have perhaps a communist mayor. It's not even believable, my beautiful New York.
My beautiful New York. The president, of course, in Washington right now. And we want to start with the backdrop for these elections in the nation's capital. Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall is there right now with more, and it's good to see you, Tyler. This is, of course, happening, people voting on the same day that the government shutdown reaches the all-time here, 35 days, and will, within hours, be in record territory. The president has really tried to frame this race in New York City as an important one, and has even threatened pulling federal funding if Mamdani wins.
Right, and that comes after the president has already frozen $18 billion in funding for New York City infrastructure projects, with the basis being that the government shut down and then the OMB had the ability to claw back those funds. So it's definitely playing a role here, is definitely a backdrop. And Joe, at the moment, we can say there's not much movement, but there does appear to be a glimmer of hope, because we did hear from Senate Majority Leader John Thune yesterday, who said that there seems to be an off-ramp appearing. Now, we should caution, of course, that these talks are very fragile, and our understanding is they're not happening at the leadership level, but there seems to be momentum among rank and file members on a bipartisan basis to reach some sort of solution to reopen the government. As Joe, today the Senate voted for the 14th time and failed to pass the same stopgap measure that would at least open the government through November 21st. The deal that's emerging is one that we kind of have been expecting, which would be that Democrats would be guaranteed a certain vote date for extending the Affordable Care Act Obamacare premium subsidies in exchange for reopening the government. And then there could be some other element here that includes a 3-bill minibus reportedly and other guarantees for a fuller year appropriations process, because as you well know, and you've been asking every lawmaker, there seems to be a back and forth on whether or not Republicans really want to pass a longer term CR, and this could be a potential off ramp.
This is a great update. And, you know, we've also been hearing, Tyler, from lawmakers and congressional watchers, if you will, over the past really 24 to 48 hours, who seem to think that this week we could see this shutdown end. That is what would be required to fulfill SNAP benefits. The president of the United States on Truth Social earlier today, SNAP benefits, he writes, which increased by billions and billions of dollars during crooked Joe Biden's disastrous term in office, will be given only when radical left Democrats open up the government, which they can easily do, and not before. Tyler, he's currently funding 50% of these benefits, which we used to call food stamps.
Right, exactly. SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And Joe, this comes one day after the Department of Justice said that it would partially fund these benefits for at least through November while the government remains shut down. And why there was talk that there could be momentum this week is because millions of Americans woke up on November 1st over the weekend without their SNAP accounts replenished. 1 in 8 Americans currently receives food benefits through the program. So this is a huge pressure point on both sides of the aisle. And there's a lot of Americans that are currently in need. Now, President Trump's post raises a lot of legal questions, a lot of economic questions, a lot of political questions on what this is going to look like going forward, because we had heard that the USDA was going to use up a pile of contingency funding related to SNAP, but that they weren't really going to go further than that. And that's why this was only going to be partially funded. So it's something that we're going to be watching closer because it has such broad ranging implications.
Tyler, we thank you, as always. Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall in our D.C. bureau. I'm Joe Mathieu in New York, where we're following races, of course, not only here in Manhattan, but across the river in New Jersey. And I do have an update for you. Before we bring in Romaine Bostick, we're just hearing now from National Airport, from the FAA in Washington, D.C., that they have lifted the ground stop at DCA. They are advising of a ground delay, but the main runway opened just about 15 minutes ago, so it looks like flights are resuming. But if you're on your way to the airport, or if you're stuck there watching us on TV in the lounge, you could be there for a little bit longer as we work this out. There were reports of a threat that had been phoned in. To New Jersey, where Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick is standing post throughout the day here following the gubernatorial election there, and one that many polls suggest is too close to call. Romaine, there's a bit of history in New Jersey, as you well know. The Garden State, kind of like Massachusetts, likes to have a check on who's in the White House, and has typically had a gubernatorial winner here with the party opposite of those controlling the executive. Is this going to be an exception this year?
Well, potentially, Joe. I know you're a student of history, and actually, frankly, to be honest, history actually isn't on Mikey Sherrill's side. She is the Democrat, and she is, for right now, the front runner, but only by a couple of percentage points, depending on what poll you pick. But here's the thing when it comes to history. Never have we seen the leading party, meaning so the Democratic Party, having 3 consecutive turns at the governor's mansion. Remember, Phil Murphy, he is the outgoing governor. He's had served 2 terms here. And Mikey Sherrill, also a Democrat, if she were to win, that would actually defy history here in making her continue that streak for a 4th year here, for another 4 years, excuse me, Joe. And Jack Ciattarelli has really been leaning in to a lot of what would normally be considered the Democratic base, really reaching out to Black and Latino voters, particularly Latino voters that actually started to gravitate a little bit more towards Trump in the last presidential election. Ciattarelli's campaign saw that as an opportunity, and they've been campaigning heavily in some of the Latino strongholds in this state.
We've seen the president weigh in a couple of times recently, at least on Truth Social. I know there was a tele-rally that he held last evening. Romaine, he's been seizing on energy as the key issue in this race. If you want energy prices to go down, vote for the Republican. Is that resonating in New Jersey?
Well, I'll tell you this. Energy prices are resonating with voters, and in fact, it's driving a lot of them to the polls. The question is, what's the actual solution? Both Jack Ciattarelli and Mikey Sherrill have sort of outlined proposals for how they think they could rein in energy prices. For Ciattarelli, part of it is pulling out of some of the climate agreements that this state had agreed to. Mikey Sherrill has proposed actually freezing power prices. But remember, it really goes a lot deeper than that. A big part of the reason for the jump in energy prices here in the state is because of the build out of AI data centers, and there are more coming, Joe, including 2 gigantic ones, one in central New Jersey by CoreWeave and another in southern New Jersey, not far from Atlantic City. Both of those would effectively double the amount of available data center capacity in this state within the next year or 2. But the big rub here is to increase the actual capacity for electricity to serve that. Well, that takes a lot longer than a year or 2 to get up and running. And right now, the state is way behind on that. So some of the proposals that the candidates have put out there, they actually don't address that issue. So it'll be interesting to see not so much what who voters choose, but more importantly, what the winner can actually say come tomorrow with regards to how they're going to address that.
Really interesting. Live from Jersey City, we're lucky to have Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick on the case today, and he's going to be playing a big role in our special election coverage and extended edition of Balance of Power that starts at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Glad to say we can add the voice of Lanhee Chen, a fellow in American Public Policy Studies at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, former candidate for California State Controller. That was in 2022, and he was the policy director on Mitt Romney's presidential campaign in 2012. Lanhee, it's great to have you. Everyone's trying to nationalize these races. That's what we all do in this business. We're looking for bellwethers. How about you?
Well, Joe, I think that's a great observation. Increasingly, American politics defies the old axiom that Tip O'Neill had. All politics is local. Well, not anymore. All politics now is national. And we're seeing that in the Virginia governor's race, the New Jersey governor's race, to some degree, the New York mayoral. And out here in California, where I'm sitting, over Proposition 50, which is the big redistricting initiative that Gavin Newsom put much of his political capital behind. So the reality is so much of this election that we're seeing this year, and I would venture to say in future years, is going to be a referendum on national politics and particularly Donald Trump.
Well, we wanted to talk to you about this redistricting effort in California. This has been a remarkable story to see unfold. It's now, of course, well, it started in Texas, but now has involved any number of states that will be redrawing congressional maps. I spoke last evening, Lanhee, with Frank Luntz, the pollster and founder of FIL, and asked him which of these races was the most important for him tonight. That's the one he picked. Here's what he said.
It's the California redistricting ballot initiative, because that's going to determine who controls Congress. If the Democrats are successful, if they win that initiative, it will be 5, maybe even 6 seats switching from Republican to Democrat as they carve up the state more politically. That California initiative is going to have a bigger impact on American politics than anything that happens between now and Election Day 2026.
That's saying a lot from Frank Luntz, and the money has been remarkable in this campaign. Lanhee, Democrats have thrown almost $100 million in ads to boost Prop 50, according to Ad Impact. Republicans with $38 million, and a lot of folks are expecting a blowout. What's about to happen in California?
Well, I don't know that it'll be a blowout. I think that the measure is poised to pass. I think it will probably be closer than people expect. You know, that margin could be somewhere, let's say, between 5 and 10 points. But look, here's the reality of this. This was an initiative that when we began the process, when the initiative was first put forward by Governor Newsom several months ago, I think a lot of people would have told you, Joe, it didn't look like it was going to pass. It looked like it'd be a very difficult road. But what Gavin Newsom did was very smart. A couple things. First of all, as we've talked about already, he nationalized this. He made this about California versus Donald Trump. And that framing ended up being very successful. I'd say number two, he was able to get national Democratic Party constituencies and interests engaged in this campaign. So he raised a lot of money, not just from his base of donors, but also more broadly from various interests across the country who wanted to make sure that Democrats had an advantage going into this midterm election cycle. And then the last thing is, for Gavin Newsom's own prospects, this was really a vehicle for him to get out and campaign nationally, to get his name out there. We think he's going to run for president in 2028, and this was a great jumping off point for him. So this has become, I think Frank Luntz is right, a bellwether in a lot of ways for how next year's election is going to go, because what's going to happen if Prop 50 passes is Republicans will go down to as few as 4 representatives. Think about that for a minute. The state of California is massive. To only have 4 members of Congress from California who are Republicans is remarkable, but that's going to be the impact of this initiative.
That's a big deal. So if you're Darrell Issa, Ken Calvert, some of the other Republicans who are going to be directly impacted by this, are you trying to figure out if you can stay in Congress right now, or are you adopting a different strategy to run in a different district?
Well, it's kind of dastardly what they've done, actually, Joe. They've actually put 3 Republican incumbents up against one another. Ken Calvert, Darrell Issa, and Young Kim, all 3 people whom I know well and whom I think have been terrific members of Congress. They're going to have to figure it out because they've essentially been drawn into, if you look at their residences, roughly the same district. So they're going to have to make some decisions about whether they run there, run somewhere else. It's going to be a very challenging situation. And then districts, Joe, that had been competitive for Republicans. So, for example, Orange County, Katie Porter's old district, that's a district that Republicans have always felt would be very competitive, has gone from being about a 3-point differential in registration to a 13-point differential in registration. So you're talking about districts that had been competitive that are not competitive anymore. It's going to be a very tough road for Republicans in the House coming out of this initiative passing.
This is going to be something. You know, whether we're talking about redistricting on a great sort of grander party level or the gubernatorial races we're looking at in Virginia and New Jersey, even the mayoral race in New York, they all have costs in common, prices and inflation that are driving decisions at the polls. Lanhee, when you think back to when you were advising Mitt Romney on policy, what do you make of this being the stubborn issue that's getting both Republicans and progressive Democrats elected, depending on the scenario?
Americans vote their pocketbooks. It's a very, very simple dynamic. We've seen it in pretty much every election going back over the last, certainly in my lifetime in politics. That's been the issue that fundamentally, with the exception, we had the 9/11 period. There have been periods where foreign policy issues have been more salient. But fundamentally, elections in America do come down to how Americans feel about their personal financial situation. And I think that's what you're seeing play out in this election as well. That's what's going to play out in 2026. I know we talked about the government shutdown and when that's going to end. I got news for you. By the time we get to next November in the midterm elections, that shutdown could be a distant memory for many Americans.
That's right.
The issue they're going to care about most when they go to vote for a member of Congress is, how am I feeling about my personal economy? How am I feeling about my economic opportunities? And I think that's something you're going to continue to see as a dynamic that's important going into 26, 28, and beyond, because that is something that Americans fundamentally hold in mind very closely when they go to the ballot box. And by the way, to speak to the nationalization of this, that's not just for members of Congress. That extends even to local representatives as well now. So the nationalization of American politics, the rise of economic policy and economic interests as being key, those are all things we're watching closely.
Lanhee, it's great to have you back and good to see you. Lanhee Chen with us on Election Day in America and here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, we'll get an update on the markets. A risk-off day has got the S&P down 75 points, and we'll go back to COP30. The vice president of the European Investment Bank up next, only on Bloomberg. With voting underway on this Election Day in America here in Manhattan, across the river in New Jersey, in Virginia, out to California. We'll be having much more on these races. And as the voting takes place here in the United States, Currently, it's a busy time at COP30 in Sao Paulo. The Green Summit, the Bloomberg Green Summit, is underway right now, and it's a great opportunity to bring in Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn for an important conversation they're having on climate at COP30. Vonnie, take it away.
Joe, thank you so much. Yes, I'm here with Ambroise. He's the responsible at the EIB, the European Investment Bank, for everything climate action related, environmental development policy and so on. So welcome and thank you for joining us. First, let me ask you a broad question about all these supranational and national goals that are trying to be met. They're not being met. Is it pointless having these goals in the first place because we're not getting where we need to be?
Well, we are making a lot of progress. When you look at the climate commitments of multilateral development banks or their financing on climate projects, this is year after year a record level. So what you see is more and more multilateral development institutions, including the European Investment Bank, are developing projects that are targeting climate objectives. But what you see also at the same time is the impact of climate change in the real life of people. That is also something that explains why we have more and more projects to finance.
In total, you have about $100 billion at your disposal for green and climate and development needs. You have about $50 billion. Where is that going?
So what we do at EIB is 90% oriented in Europe and 10% outside Europe. And what we have in terms of sharing of projects is 60% climate. The target we have in our objective is at least 50%. And the rest can be health projects, can be projects that have a significant impact, but not necessarily climate projects. The climate projects are mostly related to energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency. We can also do nuclear. And we have also projects that have that are related to innovation in the green industry.
So let me ask you about that, because there is a bit of a bifurcation. There's a lot of excitement about the new technologies that are getting developed, geothermal, battery technology, all around the world, from China to Europe to the United States, right? There's also a sort of a, if I can say, doomsday scenario out there, to use the Bill Gates word that sort of went viral. I'm curious, do you ignore the naysayers on this when you're looking at projects and just hope that each individual project makes a difference?
Well, what we try to do is to do two things at the same time. We think we need to scale up projects, and that's what we've done in Europe. Last year, for example, we have done 31 billion euros of renewable energy projects. And we do that because it's good for climate, it's good for trying to get electricity price down, and it's also good for securing our energy efficiency, energy security. But at the same time, you need to push for innovation, because you don't know what's going to be successful, but certainly some of these ideas will. And that's why we are also very active in supporting projects that have a high innovative content, like in the batteries, for example, for electric vehicles.
It is a particular environment right now. It seems to have changed over the last couple of years, and it's not just in the United States, it's elsewhere as well. So I'm curious, in this particular environment, are you finding it more difficult to mobilize private capital? What are you doing to mobilize more private capital when perhaps the appetite may not be there?
Let me say that at least what we have is in Europe, our government behind us. We have adopted last month our new climate strategy. It's a 5-year strategy, and it has been adopted unanimously by the 27 member states. And the first objective that we have is to stay the course, because we think we need to show that we care about climate financing. And the second objective is to try to make it more linked to competitiveness, but also to try to have the simplification, because it's true when you listen to SMEs that there are a lot of reporting that should be avoided, basically. And that's what we are trying to do. Now, we are going to have more means, including for adaptation. We are doubling our objective on adaptation. And that will help us also do more with the private sector in terms of blending, in terms of de-risking, do more projects with the private sector.
How much do you look at the regulations of a country before you go in? I mean, obviously regulations are quite strict in France and Germany, right? But what about the sub-Saharan countries that you're looking at and other countries you might be looking at?
Well, we look at projects, and when we have corporates, for example, what we do is trying to see if their strategy is consistent with what we expect in terms of Paris alignment, in particular, of our projects. Now, what I would say, though, is what we try to do is, part of the issue is to have more capacity building, especially in poor countries, where you need, to assess climate risk. It's not easy. And to transform climate risk into adaptation plan into projects. So we have put in place a program that is called Greening the Financial System that helps central banks, financial institutions in poor countries, especially in Africa, to put in place these kind of programs that will help them respond to your question about how can we make sure that we are all going in the same direction.
And finally, Mr. Fayolle, I have to ask you about your thoughts on that Bill Gates memo, because it did reverberate around the world. He seemed to be suggesting that there is a pile of money and some of it now has to come out of climate in order to make sure that children's health and welfare gets taken care of. Is that true or a false dichotomy?
Well, what I think is that it is true that you need to spend more money on vaccines, on health, and on poverty reduction. And that's what we try to do also as EIB, especially in the vaccines sector. But at the same time, what is also clear is that the poor countries, especially in Africa, are those who pay the highest price for climate change and its consequences. And that's why we need to spend also a lot of money on climate change and supporting projects that fight against climate change. And that's why I think you need to have both.
Do it all. Mr. Fayolle, best of luck at COP30, and we hope to get an update after you're finished. We'll send it back to you in the studio. Joe.
All right, Vonnie, thank you so much for a smart conversation at COP30 of balancing a couple of storylines today on this election day in America, but the Bloomberg Green Summit underway right now in Sao Paulo. And we wanted to make sure we brought that to you as part of our conversation today on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu at World Headquarters in New York with election coverage that will stretch throughout the day and throughout the evening, including right here in Manhattan. Bloomberg's Myles Miller, in fact, is in Brooklyn Heights right now as he tracks the mayoral race that's happening here in the city. And what looks like a blowout for Zoran Mamdani, despite Republican efforts, Myles, to steer GOP voters to Andrew Cuomo. Is this late effort putting a dent in this race?
It'll remain to be seen. Yeah, I think the late endorsement, if you will, by Donald Trump of Andrew Cuomo would probably do more to get Democrats who outnumber Republicans in this city out to the polls as a vote against Donald Trump. What we know is that this morning, Zoran Mamdani told supporters that any victory in this race is a mandate for his progressive agenda. It's a very confident statement for a 34-year-old who was relatively unknown before jumping into this race. He had been a big proponent of free buses, and that's what he was basically known for. That new Suffolk University poll that came out about a few days ago showed that there was a 10-point lead over Governor Andrew Cuomo by Mamdani, and that Curtis Lee was trailing at 11 points. But yes, as you said, this has been a race that has been largely defined by generational and ideological divides, and then you throw in the Trump factor, throwing a big wrench into this race. This extraordinary, really, crossover endorsement tells us that this is a Republican president who feels he can do a lot more, meaning he can meddle a lot more with Andrew Cuomo than he'd be able to do with Mamdani. But there is that little caveat I've been talking about, which is that Mamdani says he can work with Donald Trump because Donald Trump has been saying since he took office he wants to bring the prices down. He's talked about gas. He's talked about groceries, eggs. You remember he was talking about the price of eggs for months. Yep. This is a lot like what Mamdani's talking about, but the real focus here is how is that going to be paid for? That's the sticky point. Trump saying if Mamdani's elected, he's not sending any money to New York City.
Interesting. If we have a double-digit win or a blowout even beyond that this evening, Myles, could this be an early call? I just wonder what you're seeing procedurally while New York City attempts to count the votes in a decent amount of time.
I'm just thinking back to 2013 when Bill de Blasio won that decisive victory. That was decided pretty quickly, and that was a tight race too, right? It was de Blasio versus Joe Lhota who ran the MTA, and then Bill de Blasio, who ran the very obscure public advocate's office. This will really come down to the turnout. 730,000 people coming out to vote in the early run-up to the election, and then record number of new voters, about 104,000 new voters signing up. And you have to talk about how much of that was done by Mamdani's campaign, right? Getting new voters, people who may have just recently moved to the city, young voters, to sign up and say that they wanted to vote, and specifically for this campaign, is very different. Now, this turnout is very historic. Yep. By the time all is said and done, you'll think about 2 million ballots by tonight. Yep. This is the highest since the Dinkins-Giuliani era, and my looks may deceive you about how old I am, but, I was born at the very tail end of the Dinkins era. Dinkins' name is on my birth certificate, but I didn't know Dinkins.
Myles Miller, younger by the day. This is Bloomberg. On Election Day in America, we have so far this hour brought you to Manhattan, brought you to New Jersey, California. Now we go to the Old Dominion and the great state of Virginia. Really looking forward to our conversation with Terry McAuliffe, the former governor, someone who has been there, is about to join us here as we set the table with Bloomberg's Greg Giroux. Bloomberg government, which incidentally is in Northern Virginia. So let's get on with it, Greg. It's great to see a happy Election Day. We couldn't do an election without you here. We talked about how close the race appears to be in New Jersey a short time ago. We've talked about the blowout that's expected for Zohran Mamdani in Manhattan. How about the gubernatorial race in Virginia, where there have been big questions about candidate quality on the Republican side and what many are framing as a layup for Abigail Spanberger?
Yeah, it does seem like polls indicate that Abigail Spanberger, the former congresswoman, is going to win, and probably win decisively in the race for governor, which would extend a pattern in Virginia governor's elections of the party that usually wins is usually the party opposite the White House. So it gets a lot of outsized attention for that. We see that in New Jersey as well, although the pattern is not as clear. But Abigail Spanberger seems to be on pace to win this, and win this by a decent margin. I think a big question will be, is her victory strong enough to pull the down ballot Democrats for lieutenant governor and state attorney general along with her? And to what extent her coattails can boost the state House of Delegates Democratic majority, which is now just 51-48. Democrats are seeking an expanded majority in the state House, not only to help shape state policy the next 2 years, but because they also want to redraw congressional district lines in Virginia, and they would need Democratic government to do that.
That attorney general race in Virginia is an interesting one. Jay Jones, the Democrat, who is, and when I drive through my neighborhood, I see his name on signs with Abigail Spanberger, and of course was caught in a scandal over text messages in which he was wishing violence, political violence, upon an opponent. Republicans, his challenger, Jason Miyares, have seized on this. To what extent could this be an issue for Democrats? And does Abigail Spanberger need to get him elected tonight?
Yeah, I mean, I think the margin for Spanberger may be kind of decisive in determining whether she can pull Jay Jones over the line. Obviously, the bigger the margin for her, I think the chances that Jones can weather this increase, although polling indicates that certainly this texting issue, the scandal from 3 years ago when he sent those violent text messages, has really hurt his campaign, and polls show pretty close race between him and the Republican incumbent Jason Miyares. These three races in Virginia every 4 years, and the year after the presidential election, governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general, more often than not tend to go the same way. But this may be a rare instance where they do not. But I think Spanberger's margin will be interesting to watch tonight, and to what extent, how far the drop-off is for Jay Jones versus Spanberger's margins.
Yeah. Great to have you back, as always. Greg Giroux, look for his work covering the election on the Terminal and online. The closer for Abigail Spanberger, none other than Barack Obama. He was speaking at a rally over the weekend for the Democratic nominee. Let's listen. Guess we don't have that, but I can assure you he was there. The former governor is with us now as well, no stranger to Barack Obama. Terry McAuliffe, former governor of Virginia, former chair of the Democratic National Committee, is with us live from the Old Dominion. And Governor, it's great to see you. I really appreciate your time today on Bloomberg TV and radio. Yeah. I'm curious your thoughts on the shutdown, now 35 days old, impacting decisions in this election with so many federal workers who have been furloughed now for over a month. Does that help Abigail Spanberger in the end?
Absolutely. Republicans rightfully are being blamed for the shutdown. When I ran for governor in 2013, Republicans also had a shutdown there. I went up 10 points in the polls. They rightfully are blaming the Republicans. We have 500,000 federal workers, the most of any state in America. Maryland is right behind us. And we have a president, Donald Trump, who's now saying, well, I'm not sure we're going to pay those people back for the time that they've worked. So this is a perfect storm for Donald Trump this year in these elections. We're going to win big in Virginia. We're going to sweep the statewide. I think we may get to 60 House of Delegate seats. But ever since Donald Trump has come into office, Joe, our economy has been decimated. Our third quarter GDP went from 6 to 1.7. 7 straight months, unemployment has gone up. We have had the DOGE cuts, the federal contract cuts, now a shutdown. We've seen 3 rural health centers closed. Trump has been a disaster for Virginia. This is a lot like 2017 when Trump won in 16. We won the governorship by 9.5 points. It's turbocharged this year because it comes down to affordability. People are paying more for groceries. They're paying more for energy. And now, because of the big, ugly bill, they're paying more for health care. So it's going to be a big night, not only here, also in New Jersey, also in California, also in New York.
I'd actually love to get your take on some of the other states as someone who helped to run the party or did run the party at one point. But when it comes to Virginia, there have been questions about candidate quality on the Republican side. Governor Donald Trump held a tele-rally for winsome Earle-Sears last night and never actually mentioned her name. What do you make of Republican selection in this case? Would you have a harder race against someone else? Yeah, I mean, it's a ticket hard to make up. A very erratic ticket. The lieutenant governor, who's now running for governor, Earle-Sears, is very erratic, has not talked at all about the economy. You know, one other president ran said it's the economy stupid. Well, it is again this time. And she has not talked about the economy. You have a lieutenant governor, Republican candidate for lieutenant governor, who has had a whole slew of issues, and they've had no money. So it's really a perfect storm. And our candidate, we got great candidates. Abigail, I've known Abigail for years. She's been a great member of Congress. She will focus on job creation, health care, education funding. And, you know, Joe, at the end of the day, that's what voters want. And that's what they really want with their state elected officials. Remember, we build your roads, we run your health care, we run your education. And they just want all this bickering that goes on to stop. They want results. And that's what you're going to get with Abigail and Hashmi, and you're going to get it with our Attorney General, Jay Jones. And that's what people want. You're going to get. It's going to be a historic win tonight. And I should say the first woman governor in the history of the Commonwealth of Virginia we're actually going to be able to elect tonight. You mentioned Jay Jones. I have to ask you about his campaign, as we were just discussing with Greg Giroux. Are you concerned about this text message scandal? We hear about it a lot in an age when political violence is a real concern. Do you wish that he came out and apologized and was more deliberate in that effort? Yeah, well, Joe, he did come out right away and apologize. Abhorrent comments. I mean, nobody should talk about political violence. You know, I hated it. You know, I didn't like it when Donald Trump came out and said I could shoot someone on Fifth Ave and people will still vote for me. There is no place for that today. But I have personally known Jay for a long time. I knew his father, who recently passed, was a well-known judge down in Hampton Roads. His mother was a judge. His grandfather was a great civil rights attorney. So I know Jay's background. He will be a great attorney general. And here's the key point. Very important, Joe. So you have Jason Myers, the Republican for Attorney General, who is in lockstep with Donald Trump. He should have sued Donald Trump, the administration, on the DOGE cuts. He should have sued on all these federal contracts that we lost here in Virginia. So you now have not one Republican in Virginia in the last 10 months who's come out to defend Virginians, to support Virginians. But no, all they want to do is support Donald Trump, and our economy is anemic. And Governor-elect Abigail Spanberger tomorrow, she's going to have to deal with a crisis in our health care
and jobs, all because of Donald Trump and the Republicans in Virginia who have been too scared to stand up for the people who they should have been representing.
Donald Trump has invoked energy as a major issue in the campaign, and of course it speaks to costs of prices across the board. He said if affordability is your issue, this is on Truth Social, vote Republican. Energy costs, and as an example, are plummeting close to $2 a gallon gasoline. When energy goes down, everything else follows, and it has. I guess my question for you, Governor, is with the data center capital of the world in Virginia and more data centers coming, is it possible for a Democrat or a Republican to promise to control energy costs when we see such demand for energy in high tech?
Yeah, very good question. When I was governor, there were a lot of data centers. You know, I was very proud. I was a jobs governor. I recruited 2,100 companies, 210,000 new jobs I brought to Virginia. I did the Amazon deal and a bunch of other big deals. But in order to do those deals, Joe, you need energy.
Yeah.
If you're going to bring in those high-tech companies, you need to provide them with energy. So I come from a place as a Democrat. I've been very vocal. I'm for all of the above. I did the largest offshore wind project utility in American history off the shores of Virginia Beach. I did solar panels, but I was all for natural gas. I lost 2 gigantic manufacturing projects that I could have brought to Southwest Virginia, but Dominion could not commit to me the long-term energy contract. So if we're going to grow our economy, we as Democrats, we got to be for all of the above. I couldn't agree more. I'm all for renewables, but let's make sure that we have everything in place so that we can grow jobs, we can grow manufacturing. And that's what the Democrats need to be talking about, all of the above, and let's do everything we can to grow our economy.
This is going to turn out to be a much more pronounced conversation, Governor, that I'd love to continue with you even beyond the election. But give us your view nationally here. You ran the DNC. Frank Luntz told us last evening on Balance of Power that Democrats will sweep tonight. That also includes gubernatorial in New Jersey and Prop 50 in California. You obviously agree with him, I'm guessing, because it looks pretty close in New Jersey today.
Yeah, listen, you know, and play this tomorrow. I hope you put it on, Joe. I think Mikey probably wins by 5-6. You know, great. Went to the U.S. Naval Academy. I love her. I've known her a long time. Her husband, Naval Academy, captain of the rugby team. My son was captain of the Navy rugby team. So I love Mikey Sherrill. I love Abigail. I worked with her as governor. I think Abigail, Ralph won by 9 in 2017. I think Abigail could go 9-12. 60 House of Delegates, Joe. You heard it here. You play this back tomorrow. 59-60. It's a historic win for us. And we could win the California prop 2-1. That's a possibility, 2-1, and huge win in New York. So we sweep the board. Please play this tomorrow. And either I look like a great soothsayer or I'm one of the biggest fools in American politics.
That's some confidence. That's a man with confidence.
But I'm just telling you, but the dynamics of Donald Trump, he is minus. He's at, you know, you saw the polls. He's the lowest of any president in American history. In Virginia, he's minus 15 points. He has destroyed our economy. Soybean farmers, because of the tariffs, they're going bankrupt. Rural voters in Virginia, farmers, going bankrupt because of Donald Trump. And it's just shocking to me that nobody, now one Republican will stand up and say, Mr. President, you are wrong. This is hurting our economy. Show political courage. Get up and do what's right. I'm all about jobs. I'm a jobs governor. And we need someone in that White House who's focused on people's jobs, their health care, keeping energy prices low, keeping grocery prices low. So big night for us, Joe. Tomorrow, I want this thing replayed tomorrow at 1 o'clock.
All right, producer James has his assignment. You're making his job easier, Governor. Terry McAuliffe, thank you for being here live on Bloomberg TV and radio on Election Day in Virginia and across the country. We appreciate your insights, and we will see. Let's see if Mikey Sherrill pulls out 5 or 6 points, and we'll play some of that tape back tomorrow with Terry McAuliffe. Great conversations across the board, and I want to thank everybody for being part of it. We'll meet you back here at 5 p.m. Eastern for a special extended edition of Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg.